Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. Our series, The Wonderful World of Genealogy, has been put on hold for a short time, and in its place we offer an occasional series called Notable Novocastrians. This is an audio extract from the presentation given by Dr. Jude Conway at the Society's February 2023 meeting. The complete version can be viewed on our YouTube channel. Jude Conway has developed a passion for writing and speaking about women who have stood out in the history of Newcastle and the Hunter Valley. In this podcast, Jude tells us of the life of Professor Beryl Nashar.
Hi everyone, so I'm Jude Conway. I'm a historian of Newcastle and the Hunter region, and I specialise in women who break through barriers or stand out from the crowd. That's my speciality in history. So tonight I'm looking at Professor Beryl Nashar from the University of Newcastle. So Beryl Nashar was born Beryl Scott in Maryville on July the 9th, 1923. For those not in Newcastle, Maryville is a suburb, an industrial suburb of Newcastle. Beryl's father, Philip Scott, had arrived in Australia from Glasgow when he was about 12. He took an apprenticeship as a fitter and turner, but by the time he retired, he was maintenance engineer at Stewart and Lloyd's tube makers. Her mother, Ida Harris, had a lot of grey matter, according to Beryl, and went without the niceties of life to ensure that their 4 children, Beryl was the oldest of 4 closely spaced children, that they all went on to the leaving certificate at school. Her mother-in-law couldn't understand why they would bother, but all 4 ended up excelling professionally. Now, Beryl's first school was Tighes Hill Infants, which I just walked past today, coincidentally. But when her father was working at the Cardiff Railway workshops, they moved and she went to primary school at Cardiff. She used to have to walk through fields on her way to school, and she loved observing nature. So that was that early interest in what was around us. And she remembered nature study classes in primary school. She used to enjoy those. She always came top of the class, and she was selected for Newcastle Girls High School, which was the school for girls who wanted to stay on to the leaving certificate in those days. Beryl was in the A class at Girls High, studying English, French, German and Latin, which is what the A class did in those days, and also mathematics and a little science. She never failed anything except German, and that was because she hated the German teacher and the German teacher hated her in return. But she had a crush on her science teacher. Her science teacher was Lillian Whiteoak, who had studied at Sydney University and had studied geology. And Beryl was influenced by Lillian to do geology instead of chemistry, was probably the more usual option for 4th and 5th year. And not many schools actually offered geology in those days, especially girls' schools. Beryl reckoned she wasn't outstanding at high school. She was in the A class at a selective school, but in her view, she wasn't outstanding. She was a plodder. And in fact, she did the leaving certificate twice. The first time she passed, but she didn't get the scholarship she wanted. That she wanted to ease the financial burden on the family. They weren't very well off. So for a second attempt in 1941, no one was more surprised than Beryl herself when she topped the state in geology. She was awarded what was called an exhibition in those days from the University of Sydney And that, your fees were paid and you received an allowance, probably received a book allowance as well. And she also received a Teachers College scholarship. So she was set up after her second attempt. Beryl got enrolled in Earth Sciences at Sydney Uni, which was geology and geography. And she soon became aware of the influence of Edgeworth David, who was a former professor of geology at Sydney Uni and famous as a pioneer for allowing women in the geology department, both as staff and as students, and in discovering the Greta coal measures in the Hunter Valley in 1886 and for other experts. As an undergraduate, Beryl won the Edgeworth David Prize for paleontology. At the end of her third year, she was asked to join the staff as a demonstrator, like a tutor. So she deferred doing honours and earned some money for a year. And in 1946, for her honours, she researched the geology of the Stanhope district. I don't know whether anyone knows where it is, but it's northwest of Branxton, in the Hunter Valley. And she found everyone in Stanhope had known Edgeworth David, that he'd stayed in their homes or in their parents' homes. Beryl spent all her vacations in the field, and she fell in love with every rock outcrop of the rocks. And her field supervisor reckoned that the rocks talked to her as well. So she graduated with first-class honours and won the university medal. She worked as a demonstrator again the following year, teaching a number of returned servicemen. This was 1947, and the government was giving scholarships to returned servicemen, one of who rose to be the head of Australian Oil and Gas Company. In 1948, she had to decide, would she be a geologist? And she wasn't sure what life would be like as a woman geologist in the field, or would she be a teacher? Now, she was bonded to the education department, so she decided to do her diploma of education, and she topped the year. Her first appointment in 1949 was Home Science High, later Hunter High, and now part of Newcastle High School. And the reason she was appointed there was because Lillian Whiteoak was by then the principal of that school and wanted Beryl on her staff. She'd only been teaching one day when she received an express delivery letter from the University of Tasmania offering her a job as a demonstrator. She already decided that she didn't like playground duty. She didn't like signing on and off. So she paid off her bond and she made it to Hobart in time for the start of the academic year. There, Beryl carried a full load of teaching. She wasn't just a demonstrator, and also helped design courses. So her professor obviously saw her value very quickly. And as well, she began a PhD researching volcanic rocks in Tasmania. So finding where they were, mapping them if they hadn't already been mapped, collecting them, looking at them under the microscope and doing chemical analysis. Now, before she'd left Newcastle, Beryl had been nominated by the newly formed Mayfield Rotary Club for a Rotary Foundation Fellowship. And in Hobart, she received notice that she'd been awarded one. She was the first woman in Australia to get a Rotary Fellowship and maybe the first woman in the world. She chose to go to Cambridge for a year, and she took her rock collection with her on the ship and continued her research. Her PhD research. Now in Cambridge, as well as doing her research, she also had Rotary duties. She visited members' homes, addressed Rotary clubs and inner wheel clubs for the wives of Rotarians, because it was a male-only club in those days. She attended 3 Rotary international conferences and spoke at 2 of them. She was often asked questions like, is Sydney a big town? And when she was visiting a school, one of the children was amazed that she wasn't black. Now, the Cambridge Department of Petrology and Mineralogy had students from 15 different nationalities, and they used to have coffee parties at people's houses after their working day. An Egyptian colleague brought along one of his fellow countrymen, Ali Nashar, to one of the parties. Beryl Scott met this intense, handsome PhD student who was researching Muslim philosophy, and a romance began. By the end of her year at Cambridge, Ali had proposed to her. She said yes, but she decided to return home for 2 years because she wanted to be sure that she was making the right decision. As she said, it's a big thing to marry outside your own culture, your own religion, and your own language. So she returned to her job in the geology department at the University of Tasmania and continued working in her thesis. In 1952, she became the first Australian to be awarded a geology PhD from an Australian university. She immediately returned to Cairo, and Ali and she were married on the 13th of July, 1952. He had been lecturing, by then he was lecturing at the University of Alexandria, but a few days later, they moved to Madrid in Spain because he'd been appointed director of the Egyptian Institute in Madrid, which was a diplomatic post equivalent to a culture attaché. Now, Egypt in 1952, because the Egyptian king, King Farouk, you might remember that name, led an overly extravagant lifestyle and his government was corrupt. There was an army coup d'etat led by Gamal Nasser and other generals. And that was carried out on the 23rd of July, 1952, just 10 days after their marriage. Farouk was forced to abdicate in favour of his infant son and exiled to Italy. Beryl Nashar only found out years later that Ali, her husband, had been a member of the Revolutionary Council with Nasser. Ali knew Nasser well. His mother virtually raised Gamal Nasser, and he'd been at their place when they were growing up more than he'd been at home. So it had been planned that Ali Nasser would be out of the country in Spain before the coup actually took place. So that was all fine-tuned. Now, they lived in Spain for about 15 months before Ali was recalled to Cairo. Beryl was expecting a baby by then and wanted the child to be born in Australia because she didn't want him to have to be conscripted into the Egyptian army when he was an adult. So she returned home, and on 4th of November 1953 had her son Tariq Ali in Royal Newcastle Hospital. Beryl and Tariq returned to Egypt early 1954. The revolutionary government had abolished the monarchy by then, so they didn't let the infant son be the king. And in February that year, Nasser became Prime Minister, and Beryl's husband, Ali, was appointed a minister for the equivalent of social welfare. About 6 months later, the Muslim Brotherhood attempted to assassinate Gamal Nasser. In retaliation, Nasser arrested thousands of dissenters and neutralised his rivals. Ali, by then, had actually fallen foul of Nasser and was briefly imprisoned. On his release, he fled to Lebanon. Beryl went for a brief visit, but they decided it wasn't the best place politically to bring up their son. So they decided that she and Tariq would come back to Australia and Ali would come to Australia when he could. Their plans never reached fruition. Ali never actually lived in Australia. He only visited. I just had to learn to live with the situation, she said. So if it wasn't for those turbulent years in Egypt, Beryl Nashar may never come back to Newcastle. So we're lucky. When she returned, she was emotionally distressed. September 1954, with a 9-month-old baby, having lost a family life and all their possessions. She went to live with her parents, who were now living off Maud Street in Mayfield West. Beryl decided she wanted to re-establish her career, and fortuitously, she saw a job advertised for a geology lecturer at the new fledgling Newcastle University College. The university, cramped into the Ties Hill Technical College, had only started taking science students in 1952 and was still under the wing of the New South Wales University of Technology, later the University of New South Wales. Beryl applied for the position and had to go down to Sydney for the interview. The Novocastrian who looked after her, she reckoned that he must have been fearful of her superior qualifications because he tried to push her into being a demonstrator. But for the interview panel, once they interviewed Beryl, it was a foregone conclusion, and she became the second geology staff member at the small university and the first woman at Newcastle University College. She commenced work in the Edgeworth David building at Ties Hill, on the Ties Hill campus, on the 25th of February 1955. Her mother was a built-in babysitter. The science staff was a mix of new appointments and old technical college staff. Their living conditions were shocking. Beryl was given a tiny partitioned section of the telephone exchange room. So for years, she worked next to the clickety-clack of the exchange. She loved the teaching, geology, mineralogy, petrology, stratigraphy, and paleontology. But in the early years, they taught over 20 hours a week. There were very few geology specimens, and equipment-wise, it was hard to even get a box of matches. One of her greatest disappointments was that she wasn't able to do any research because there was no equipment. When she was invited to give a paper at an important symposium in Hobart, probably invited by her former professor, I imagine, there was no money for expenses. So the University College warden, Ralph Basden, contributed towards the cost, and he asked the manager of BHP, who put some money in as well. In a 1969 article, Beryl denied having ever struck male prejudice, but by 2001, she admitted that she had been discriminated against salary-wise. When she'd started lecturing, she was getting 85% of the male rate, even though she had better qualifications than most of the men at the uni. By 1958, there were 4 women on the staff at the Newcastle Uni, and because arts had started up, the arts section had started up by then, they took their case for equal pay to court. Beryl was lined up to give evidence. She was a bit nervous, but a decision was reached out of court. In 1965, when the college became the autonomous University of Newcastle and geology became a full department, Beryl was appointed foundation professor, having applied for the position which was advertised throughout the world. She was still the only woman on the geology staff. There were no other women professors at Newcastle Uni until the Faculty of Medicine was established in 1978 and a woman psychiatrist, Beverly Raphael, had a chair. Beryl had had input actually into the establishment of the medical school and was on the selection committee to appoint the first dean. More about committees later. As Professor of Geology, Beryl always took the first lecture of the year and told the students the rules. For example, students must wear proper shoes in the geology department because she didn't want them to drop a box of rocks on their feet, on their thonged feet. She wasn't an authoritarian professor. She let the staff choose the subjects, their specialities, what they wanted to teach. And her department was innovative. They introduced vivas, oral tests, oral examinations instead of written. And she reckoned they were very effective because the students actually studied harder for a viva than for a written test. Now, as professor, she had to occasionally entertain groups of all men and pay the bill afterwards. In the days when women didn't do that sort of thing, she just had to be very diplomatic, she said. Perhaps it was more than just diplomacy. A Women's Weekly journalist who interviewed her in 1968 declared it would be a very hidebound male who could indulge in personality clashes with Professor Nashar. In that year, 1968, Beryl was elected by 60 male staff as the Dean of their faculty. She was the first woman Dean of Science in Australia. You hear the word first a lot in this talk. The Vice-Chancellor, Newcastle Uni Vice-Chancellor James Ortmuth, was very proud. I know in 1971, 25% of the students at Newcastle Uni were female, by the way. So this is a very male-orientated university dominated by engineering, of course. Actually, by 1968, nearly a quarter of the geology students were female. And although many of them ended up as teachers rather than as field geologists, in the 68 interview, she said the female students from 1967 had all got jobs, but they had to fossick around, which was a nice little turn of phrase. They had to fossick around to get their jobs, because what happened was they'd apply for a job and they'd sign their name using their initials, and they'd get the job even without an interview. But once of course, the company found out they were women, that their job was taken away. So the company started writing back, if you are a male, we are interested. So Beryl saw lots of discrimination in her time. Now, during the mineral boom, this is interesting, during the mineral boom from 1969 to 72, there was a mineral boom in Australia. Geology became the subject that people wanted to study. Beryl recalled we had huge numbers. We had to use 3 buses to take our first year students on an excursion compared to 1 truck formerly. She did her share of taking excursions, which she used to enjoy, and she said it's surprising what you learn around a campfire. From 1973, when biology was introduced as a subject and the boom was over, the numbers dropped. Just back to Ali Nashar, years earlier, Ali had returned to Egypt from Lebanon, and he got his old job back at the University of Alexandria. But he was never able to get a visa to get out of the country. He reckoned he knew too much. And it wasn't until 1972, after NASA had died, that Ali managed to travel to Australia for a short stay. His next visit was longer, but he couldn't get a job here. His speciality, Muslim philosophy, was not taught in Australia at that time. And he wrote a book during that stay, but he missed the academic climate. So he accepted an offer of a professorship in Monaco. By this time, his political views had changed completely. He had been a young revolutionary with socialist tendencies, but he saw firsthand how power corrupts all sides of politics, because NASA had been getting support from the Russians and, had spoken words of, socialism or communism in the early days, but he was corrupted just like King Farouk had been. Anyway, Ali Nashar died on the 1st of September 1980. Knowing that he was dying, he'd managed to get back to Egypt 2 weeks before he died, so he could die in his homeland on Egyptian soil. Now, before I began this research, I had assumed that Beryl had no dependents because, I used to read about her probably from about the mid-60s onwards in the Newcastle Herald. Everyone knew who Beryl Nashar was if you were in Newcastle. And there was never any mention of her son, Tariq. So anyway, I did find 2 photos when I was doing my research. The 1962 taken by photographer Ron Morrison, probably for the Newcastle Herald, and 1968 photos from the Women's Weekly. Now, it seems that Beryl, as well as her other activities, also went to do volunteer work at Tarek schools and watched him play cricket. Local history librarian Sue Ryan, who probably many of you know, told me that Beryl was her great aunt, her grandmother's sister, and updated me on Tarek. So he became a consulting geologist, married a French woman, and lives in Sydney. Now, just back to Beryl. Besides her lecturing, she published 4 books. The first is a geology of the Hunter Valley. And she also did a book on the geology of the Sydney Basin, which you might think, like me, it was just around Sydney, but that actually covers the geology from Newcastle down to Batemans Bay and west to the Great Dividing Ranges. She found she was good at writing books suitable for school children, explaining geological concepts in simple terms. She'd been surprised by what children could understand at an early age and how they could get their tongues around fossil names. Her 2 grandchildren used to ask her, "Grandma, when are we going fossil hunting?" She also had a number of articles published in scientific journals, including one examining dikes in Port Stephens area. Beryl Nashar's expertise as a geologist and a manager was used by her university, local boards and committees, and governments. In fact, committees became the bane of her life, she said. An early one was the Hunter Valley Research Foundation, set up after the disastrous 1955 Maitland floods. She was invited to join their advisory panel and participated in their mitigation investigations. That was their initial purpose, by testing samples of sand and rock to ascertain the course and behaviour of the Hunter River through its history. She was on the Lord Mayor's Committee, working to achieve autonomy for the University College and to search for a new campus, a new site to build a new university. And she said Shortland was definitely the best choice. The new buildings were ready to start receiving students in 1966. And coincidentally, I started there 2 years later. Just made me realise how, we just sort of took it for granted, but how new it was when I was there. Now, Beryl joined the board of directors of the Royal Newcastle Hospital when it was reformed in 1965 after being run by an administrator. The new board, appointed by a Liberal state government, was able to regain the confidence of the medical staff, which had been lost previously. For the entire time she was a member, Beryl was the only woman. She thinks she had a unique place in the history of the hospital by being the only director to have attended a board meeting in her night attire and dressing gown. This was in 1972. She'd had a pin inserted in a fractured femur by Dr. Gordon Kerridge, and who thought there was no reason why she should send an apology. So she was ferried by a wheelchair from the ward to the boardroom. She sat on many of the subcommittees and became the chairman of the finance committee, which taught her a lot about the economics of institutions. However, her experience on the hospital board left a sour edge. In December 1981, having given 16 years and 3 months, to be exact, voluntary service, no payment, she learnt from the media that she and 4 other members who'd all been appointed way back were not reappointed by the Rann Labor government. Beryl was not a member of any political party and was annoyed that a woman who, in a way, replaced her was the secretary of a local ALP branch and a housewife, which Beryl doubted gave her sufficient experience to have much to say about how a $50 million institute should be run. She did receive a certificate of appreciation, 4 years and 8 months later. Beryl Nashar retired from the university after 25 years in the job on the 25th of February 1980. But she didn't retire from committees, of course. In 1981, she was invited to sit on the board of directors of the Greater Newcastle Building Society and was elected chairman in 1983, which position she held for 3 years. And during that time, she was the only woman chair of any building society in Australia. So as well as firsts, the word only woman also comes in a lot. Also from 82 to 87, she was a member of the academic committee of the Higher Education Board. She said she gave her time because she felt it would have been a step backwards for women if she hadn't accepted the invitations. She declared, "I never overstood the mark," and said I was a feminist or anything like that. So, yes. My next little section is Beryl's opinions on women in public life. This is Beryl's thoughts. Women could not waffle on without knowing the facts, as many men did, and could not afford to fail. You have to work twice as hard as a man to get recognition, she said, and accordingly, she slept only 6 hours a night. In 1976, she declared that Australian women were lagging behind women of Britain and Southeast Asia in taking positions in public life. And in many cases, women were their own worst enemies because they did not apply. She seems to have forgotten her female geology students applying for jobs. She was taken to task for blaming women themselves. But over the years, she was pleased to see more women applying and obtaining well-paid government positions. By 1989, Beryl could say, "These days, you will hardly ever hear about a first for women. That's good because we are now accepted." Despite not admitting that she was a feminist, she did admit that the women's movement had been most useful in activating women to express their problems and needs. Now, back when Beryl had returned to Australia in 1954, she couldn't join Rotary, of course, it was an all-male club. So she joined Business and Professional Women's Club in Newcastle. It was an outlet away from academic life and family life and terrific for female fellowship. Unsurprisingly, she was elected president from 58 to 61 and in 1968 as well, and then became national president from 64 to 66. And in 1974, she was surprised and awed to be elected world president of the International Federation of Business and Professional Women. So that was leading 300,000 women in 56 countries to work on improving the status of women. Newcastle University deemed her position brought the university honour. So she deemed that she could use her secretary to assist her. She had a bag permanently packed. It was nothing, she said, for me to go to London for an executive meeting over a weekend. I never missed a lecture, she said, but I had to reschedule. It's amazing what you could do if you try, if you're Beryl Nashar. Now, women were allowed in a Rotary from 1989. So at some point, Beryl became active in a Rotary club, and I think, we think it was at Mayfield, her original sponsor. Now, you might think all those activities would kill someone's time, but in the late 1950s, Beryl bought and cleared a block of land at Charm Haven on the Central Coast and practically built a weekender with her own hands. The family retreated there every possible weekend for picnics, swimming, prawning, and fishing. They had a boat, of course. Now, one of the grandchildren that said, "When are we going looking for fossils?" has written a poetry book, a poetic elegy of Tuggerah Lake, which is right near their weekender, and dedicated it to Beryl. Now, just a couple of little extras. In the late 70s, Beryl had her portrait painted by an artist called Phil Stone in Modigliani style, we might say, except she has got clothes on. And in 1991, it was presented to the university, and it's now in special collections. To finish off, Beryl received many awards. In 1972, she was made an officer of the Order of the British Empire for her contribution to education and international relations. In 1988, the University of Newcastle gave her an honorary doctorate of science. And there were many, many other awards, both awarded to her and awards that people set up in her name. Professor Beryl Nashar, a hardworking woman who achieved many groundbreaking firsts, died in 2012, having lived an eventful, rewarding life and having enriched her hometown of Newcastle. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this podcast about the fascinating life of Beryl Nashar. There will be more in this series, and we look forward to you joining us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.